Thank you, Don. Psalm 148 is a psalm of praise. And there's a connection in that psalm to Father's Day. So if you tune in for the next few minutes, hopefully you'll see that connection. Today we're going to think about the Highlands, the islands, and Psalm 148, God's providence in family history. And in particular, we're going to look at the life of an individual named Summerlid, as well as learn a little bit about his wife and some of their family history. And in particular, we're going to focus on one of their descendants who is an F14, that is, who is the filial 14th generation. So an F1 would be a son or a daughter, an F2 would be a grandson or a granddaughter. So an F14, I'll let you figure out how many grands that is. The scripture we're starting from, and we're not going to cover all of Psalm 148 in depth because we don't have the time, but we're going to focus on verses 7 through 13, and in particular, the latter verses in that segment. Psalm 148, remember, is about praising God, God being glorified. Praise the Lord from the earth, ye dragons and all deeps, fire and hail, snow and vapors, stormy wind fulfilling his word. Mountains and all hills, fruitful trees and all cedars, beasts and all cattle, creeping things and flying fowl, kings of the earth and all people. And we'll be thinking particularly today about some of the kings of the earth and some people. Princes and all judges of the earth, both young men and maidens, old men and children, let them praise the name of the Lord, for his name alone is excellent. His glory is above the earth and the heaven. Today, we're going to remind ourselves of how great God is. And we're going to do that by thinking about family history. And in family history, you can think about your own family history, as well as the family history of others, and in particular, the family history of others going back multi-generations that has had, eventually in time, an impact on your life or on the lives of people close to you. In the picture there in the top right, you see John Calvin, because we're going to be thinking about some things that happened in Scotland. And we're going to think about somebody who was born in the room shown by the bottom right. We'll get to that soon. But keeping in mind the overall context is that God is great, and he shows his glory in his creation, including his human creation. I think of the psalm, "How great thou art." Well, in verse 7, it referred to creatures of the deeps. So you can think of crabs and squid and whales. And in the top right there, that's a Norwegian lobster. It's also called a Dublin prawn. And that's the big cash crop in the shore waters of Scotland. Verse 9 talks about the trees that God has made. And creatures live in the trees, such as wood pigeons and squirrels. And there's a lot of trees. In fact, Scottish pines used to dominate Scotland, and then a lot of them were removed. And now a lot of trees are being replanted there, but some of the environmentalists are very upset because what's being replanted are Sitka pines, not native Scottish pines. They both look a lot like pine trees to me. Verse 10, we're reminded that there are land animals of all sorts, and one example of that would be badgers, as well as the creepy critters that are mentioned. One example of that would be the trapdoor spider, which builds a little den, and then it has a little covering. And when the vibrations of the soil indicate that something to eat is walking close by, the trapdoor spider jumps out of his trapdoor and snags it and eats it. Okay, so keep this in mind as you go to lunch today. Earthworms, of course, would be another example of creepy critters, and they do all kinds of wonderful things. They tunnel through the soil and cause it to be aerated, and they allow for water drainage, and a lot of that water has minerals and other things that are needed for plants that have their root system in the water. And a lot of good is done by earthworms. In fact, in some pastures, the total weight of earthworms that are under the soil working are greater than the total weight of the cattle in the pasture. Verse 10 there's a reference to flying fowl. If you thought that was a bald eagle on the left, the right, your other left, those are actually sea eagles, which would be the eagle that you'd find in Scotland. The fishhawk or osprey is shown there with something to eat. Here's a belted kingfisher zooming down and zapping the water with his feet and getting himself something to eat. That's why they're called kingfishers. They like to eat fish. They're not the only ones. The red grouse is Scotland's special variety of the willow ptarmigan. And then we have some pipers here. On the top left, we have the wood sandpiper. Bottom left, we have the common sandpiper. And on the right, we have the bagpiper. Y'all caught that? Okay. I will not try to imitate the sound of bagpipes. And then we get on to verse 11, which is where we're going to focus more of our attention today, and that is on the people. Because when you study family history, you're studying the lives of people and the people that went before them and the people that went before them. And wanted to make sure I got in a photograph of my wife there on the bottom left. And that's my youngest grandson on the bottom right. And like his grandfather, he puts his foot in his mouth. Okay, well, in Isaiah 42:10, we read, "Sing unto the Lord a new song, and his praise from the end of the earth, ye that go down to the sea, and all that is therein, the isles," or you could translate that, coastlands, "and the inhabitants thereof." And we're going to think about some of the inhabitants of some coastlands. In fact, some of those coastlands were islands in what are called the Highlands and the Islands of Scotland. That would be sort of the northwest part of Scotland, and it's hillier there. It's higher elevation. And then the islands that are to the west are called the Hebrides. The islands to the north are called the Orkneys. We are reminded in the Psalms that God is still creating. He's not creating physical material like he did during creation week, but he is creating spirits, personalities, the part of us that is not physical. Every time a new human is created by God inside the womb of that human's mother, that is a creative work of God. And Psalm 102:18 says, "This will be written for the generation to come, that a people yet to be created may praise the Lord." And there are generations yet future who will glorify God one way or another. And the word that's translated created there is bara, the exact same verb that is used in Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:21 and Genesis 1:27. So it's the same kind of God making something new out of nothing. And only he can do that. So here's the three benefits of studying family history from a biblical perspective. It can help us to better appreciate God as our own personal creator. Also, learning about family history of specific people who've made a big impact on the world for good can help us to appreciate how God has been working in times past and in other places in order to provide his blessings to the world and to specific individuals in the world, including ourselves. Many people in the history of the world and in other places than where we are now have done things that have blessed our lives. Well, if those people hadn't gotten here, we would not have those blessings that God gave to us through their lives. And so that's something that we can appreciate. And it's something that if we learn more of the work that God did in order to get those people successfully on this planet so that they could become conduits of God's blessing to us, we can appreciate how how huge it is, the amount of work that God has done in order to provide us with the blessings that He has. And then thirdly, by learning the family history of others, we can better appreciate how much God values those individuals because of all the work that He did to make sure that they successfully arrived on planet Earth so that they could have the lives that He has given them. And I've got to remind you that I'm always appreciative that God did not make me a grackle. I've mentioned that before, and maybe every time I walk into this room and you see me, you think, yeah, that's the guy who's glad he's not a grackle. That's be a good way to remember me. So that's a Father's Day perspective, that I didn't have to be who I am, and God could have made me something different. And there's a lot of birds out there that He did make birds, so He obviously could have if He wanted to. But this is a Father's Day perspective on some of the people who have affected our lives. Maybe we didn't realize it. Acts 17:26 says that God made of one blood all nations of men to dwell on the face of the earth, that He determined the times before appointed and the bounds of their habitation. God is in charge of time, and God is in charge of space. He's in charge of history. He's in charge of geography. And boundaries are specifically there as part of God's sovereign control of the planet. I'm going to dip a little bit into Viking history, and I'm going to start with this caveat. Don't believe everything you've been told about Viking history. It's not all true. Some of it has suffered revisionistic changes, and as a result, either they're adding some information that really never happened about the Vikings, such as horns on their helmets. They never wore horns on their helmets. Or subtracting information about the Vikings that really we should be told about, such as Leif Erikson was a very serious Christian who shared his faith with others. When I went to public school, I wasn't taught that part about Leif Erikson. Anyway, so real Viking history is a lot different than the way Hollywood presents it. Leif Erikson was really a evangelist, a missionary, and he shared the gospel with his family at the direction of his king, Olaf Tryggvason, and he won 2 of his brothers to the Lord as well as his mother. And his father refused to become a Christian, and his half-sister as well. But that's a whole other topic. If you were to go to Greenland today, you would see a reconstructed village, and at the site where Leif Erikson's mother had her prayer chapel, they have constructed a building which would have been similar to what she would have had, and they constructed it on the very foundation where her prayer chapel was. Before I leave the topic of Viking history and how there's a lot of errors, a lot of erroneous information given about them, there was a large group of skeletons found in the interior of England, in Repton, which was a burial of about 300 people. And the historian said those people were Vikings. And the biochemist said they couldn't be because we've radiocarboned their bones, and the amount of radiocarbon that remains in their bones after they died, after all these years, indicates that they must have died around 600s or 700s, whereas the Vikings did not flood the interior of England with what was called the Great Heathen Army until the late 800s. So you're off by a couple centuries. These must be somebody else. Of course, it's kind of tricky when they're buried with coins that weren't minted until the 800s. You know that there's something fishy about the radiocarbon dating. Well, to make a long story short, it all goes back to wrong assumptions and skipping the biochemistry involved. You take in carbon-14 while you're alive, mostly through food, and so you stop eating when you die, and as a result, you start losing radiocarbon-14 without replenishing it through food. Well, the Vikings didn't eat much land-based food, and that's where most of your carbon-14 comes from. So, in other words, The carbon-14 based age assignment for the Viking bones was a problem for about 30 years, and it was based on a failure to appreciate that Vikings ate lots of fish. And fish contain much less carbon-14 than land-based foods like grains, vegetables, fruits, dairy products, livestock, meats. Therefore, unless the dietary differences are adjusted for, carbon-dated skeletons of fish-eating Vikings appear to be 100 years or even more older than what they are. So, for a more modern example, when I die and somebody radiocarbon dates my skeleton, they're going to say, this guy died during the Civil War, because I've eaten a lot of fish over the years. And so there never was a whole lot of carbon-14 in me to start with, and therefore when you measure what's left, some might assume that I'd lost a whole lot over a long period of time when really it was never there to start with. Well, anyway, skipping forward to how Christianity came to the British Isles, particularly the northern part of the island of Britain. You see there on the map what we today call Scotland. It came in different ways, but one of the more famous examples was a missionary from Ireland called Columba. And he made a little island called Iona his base, and much of his network of friends shared the gospel throughout what is now Scotland, and they developed what became known as the Celtic Church. The Celtic Church was at some point in competition with the Church of Rome that came from the continent, and a lot of that came to a head in the 600s. And we'll skip the details on that, because what we're really trying to do is set the stage for this individual named Somerled. But in the 700s, Scotland mostly lost the Celtic Church, certainly lost its dominance, didn't lose it completely. And within about a century, the Vikings were attacking Scotland and carrying off whatever they wanted to carry off. But Celtic Christianity survived in pockets, and now we come up to this individual named Somerled. And we're going to talk about him and his wife, as well as an ancestor of his named Olaf, an ancestor of Somerled, who is also the father of Olaf, named Hardrada, and Aud the Deep-Minded. So who is this King Somerled, who is an example of how God shows his greatness in the lives of individuals over multiple generations, ultimately in ways that actually impact our lives, even though we might not realize there's a connection between the impact of their lives and our own. If you look at the map in the bottom left, in the red color, you see the coastlands and islands that were ruled by King Somerled back when he was king of what were called the Islesmen. And one of his big goals was he wanted to restore the Celtic Church to the Highlands and to the Hebrides Islands. He was a big advocate of the Celtic Church, and he gave, you may as well say, he gave his career to trying to restore it to Scotland. It was not to happen in his lifetime. He was treacherously killed 6 miles west of Glasgow in connection with the Battle of Renfrew, although the way he got killed wasn't on the battlefield the usual way. As a result, his opponent won that particular war, and Scotland did not have a collection of independent churches for quite some time after that. Well, who were some of his ancestors? Because if Somerled was never born in the first place, he certainly could not have made a difference in the world of either his generation, much less any impact on the world of our generation. One of his ancestors was Harold Hardrada. Now, many of you know that the year 1066 was when the Battle of Hastings happened, when William the Conqueror successfully defeated Harold Godwinson on the east coast of England. Well, just a few days, I think that's 19 days. My wife says don't do math in public. So anyway, in the middle of October is when the Battle of Hastings happens. But a little bit before that, in the end of September, further north, not too far from York, England, was the Battle of Stamford Bridge. And at that time, the Norwegian Vikings had invaded England, and they were invading against Harold Godwinson, who a few days later would be defending against William the Conqueror. Harold Godwinson won the first battle, and then less than a month later, he lost the second battle. But in the battle that he won, he was against Harold Hardrada, who brought 300 longships of Viking warriors with him from Norway and from territories of Norway. The battle went so badly for the Norwegians that it took a lot less than that, 20-some ships, to take the survivors back home after the battle. They started with 300. That means that if you were on the Norwegian side of that battle, there was a good chance you wouldn't survive. Well, as it turned out, two of Somerled's ancestors both survived that battle against the odds. And Somerled himself was descended from Harold Hardrada, who died at that battle. Ironically, he's 3 generations away from Hardrada on one side, and then 5 on the other. If you look at the family tree there, you'll see that on the right side, he is descended from Olaf III, and Olaf was assigned to guard the boats during the Battle of Stamford Bridge. That's why he survived. Sometimes parking lot duty is not a bad idea. But Olaf survived, and as you see, 1, 2, 3, 4 generations later, you get Somerled. Now, on the other side of that family tree, you see that Harold Hardrada had a daughter named Ragnhild, and that she was the mother of Olaf the Red, who, among other activities of his very adventurous life, married Ingebjorg, and they had a daughter named Ragnhild, and she ended up marrying Somerled. So Somerled married his cousin. And Ragnhild's own ancestry is pretty amazing, because she's descended from Aud the Deep-Minded. Now, this is going to seem pretty scattered until the connections are made. The picture you see there is in Iceland, and the memorial cross there indicates that Aud the Deep-Minded would go to that place for prayer. She was a Christian, and there's a place to this day called basically Cross Hill, which is where she would go every day to pray. But she didn't start out in Iceland. In fact, she was living in Dublin for a while, married to Olaf, and Olaf assigned duties to her father, Ketil Flatnose, to collect taxes in the Hebrides. Ketil double-crossed his son-in-law and kept the tax money for himself. That was a family feud that resulted in Olaf divorcing Aud. And soon after that, Ketil died of suspicious circumstances. So Aud now is missing her husband and her father. Well, her son Thorstein was her main ally was her main support at this point, and his ally was a fellow named Sigurd, who got himself into trouble by conquering different areas of northern Scotland. And in one case, he cut off the head of a local ruler, attached the head to his saddle, I guess by the hair, and as he was showing off, trying to shock and awe people with this head bouncing next to him, his calf of his leg, which apparently he wasn't wearing pants. I guess, maybe he was wearing a kilt, who knows. But anyway, his calf contacted the tooth of this severed head, and he basically got bit by the severed head and got an infection and died of the infection. So the guy that he killed basically got even. Well, anyway, Sigurd obviously made a lot of enemies. Thorstein was his ally, so he made enemies too. He got ambushed, and now where does that leave Aud? She's divorced from King Olaf in Dublin. Her father, Ketil Flatnose, is dead. Her son, Thorstein, is dead. And she has lots of people in northern Scotland who don't like her family. So she decided, with what was left of her family, we're moving to Iceland, where I have 2 brothers, and we're going to start life there. and we're going to build a big boat in the woods quietly and sneakily, and on some dark night we're going to haul that big boat out of the woods and head out to sea and head north and take everything we can with us. And that's what they did. If you look at the very small map in the bottom left, you will see the path that they took from Scotland to the Hebrides Islands, and then through the Shetland Islands up to the Faroe Islands, and eventually to Iceland. The part that concerns us today is the first stop, which is in the Orkney Islands. Now, Aud's, if you look at the family chart there, Aud was married to Olaf. They had the son Thorstein. As you know, Thorstein's dead. Thorstein had a daughter named Groa. Groa married Duncan, and that happened in the Orkneys, and they had a child, Grelod, and Grelod ends up marrying Thorfinn Skullsplitter. But that connects their family tree with the ruling dynasty of the Orkney Islands. And so Grelod, who is the great-granddaughter of Aud, married to Thorfinn, they have Hlodver, and Hlodver gets married, and they have a child, Sigurd the Stout, and he gets killed in what is one of the most famous battles in all of Ireland, the Battle of Clontarf in 1014. But thankfully, before he did get killed there, he had left offspring. Otherwise, part of the family history we're going to get to wouldn't be there. And I'll just mention in passing that Battle of Clontarf is a very amazing battle to study. Almost everybody involved as a leader in that battle had a connection to Gormlaith, because one of the main battling rulers was her ex-husband, and against him was fighting her brother and 3 men that she promised to marry if they won the battle. And that would have been difficult if they won the battle and they all survived. But as it turned out, 2 of them died in the battle and only 1 survived, so she ends up marrying him. Very interesting piece of history there. But thankfully, before Sigurd the Stout, who was one that she had promised to marry, but he got killed in the battle, had already fathered a child, and Brian, her ex, Sigurd, who she'd promised to marry, and Brother, who she'd promised to marry, they all died in the battle, as well as her brother did. But her son survived, and in fact, he was married to the daughter of one of her husbands, but daughter from a different. It reminds you of that song, I Am My Own Grandpa, if you've ever heard that song. It's a lot of interesting, anyway. Well, we'll move on. Suffice to say, it's good that he had fathered Thorfinn II before he died in the Battle of Clontarf, and that Thorfinn II had begotten Paul, who begat Håkon, who begat Ingeborg, who married Olaf the Red, and Olaf and Ingeborg became the parents of Somerled. So without all of those people, you don't get Somerled. And so far, I probably haven't convinced you that Somerled's really important, but we're getting there. And I might add that Paul Thorfinnsson, who was part of that line I just mentioned, was also at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, and he was also assigned to guarding the boats on the shoreline, which is why he survived. He survived that battle. That battle, remember, was 1066. 4 years later, he becomes the father of Håkon. So there never would have been a Håkon if he had died, as did most of the attackers on the Battle of Stamford Bridge. Well, because of time, we'll have to skip this whole chapter of important Scottish church history in which the Lollards were sharing the gospel with people who lived in Scotland. The Lollards is a term that is used for those who followed the teachings of John Wycliffe. As you remember, Dr. Wycliffe was a proponent of putting the Bible into the English language, and he did so in the 1300s. And many of his followers went throughout England as well as Scotland, and some of them went across the water to Bohemia, what is now the Czech Republic, and some of the neighboring countries there. And his writings were studied by someone named John Huss, who eventually died for his faith. And then about 100 years later, you had, of course, Martin Luther, and the Reformation as we know it got off to full steam. But prior to the generation that saw Martin Luther and John Calvin and Ulrich Zwingli and William Tyndale, you had many evangelicals known as Lollards who were taking the gospel in the language of the people to wherever they were, including Scotland. But we have to skip that part. In fact, we're going to skip the important ministry of John Knox, which you probably have learned about in other places. He accomplished a huge amount for Scotland. But because of time, I had to fast forward us until we got to this room. This is a room I've been in before. Maybe some of you have been. And almost to the exact day, I mean, on June 19th, and this is not the 19th, so later this week, it will be exactly 453 years since a baby boy was born in this room. And that baby boy has changed all of our lives. Who is it? This is in Scotland. Well, it's King James. Now, all of you have been impacted by the King James Bible in the English language. For some of you, that's the main Bible that you read. For others of you, that was the main Bible that your parents read, or others who have had a big impact on your life have studied. But there would not have been a King James translation of the Bible without a King James. And if you think about it, not just anybody would do, because in many countries of the world, there was nobody who was like King James, who used the governmental power to sponsor and to advocate the Bible being translated into the language of the people. In fact, during the time that King James was doing just that, in many countries of the world, you got in trouble if you tried to translate the Bible into the language of the people. And in many cases would be put to death or torture, or maybe even torture just for teaching your children to memorize the Lord's Prayer or the 23rd Psalm. So the religious freedom that we enjoy today, and we are very thankful for today in America, that has not been the common lot of many generations of people who've lived before us. And so we do need to appreciate the very unusual providence of God in the freedom that we have, some of which is traceable to the man we call King James, who the English call King James I, who the Scots call King James VI, because he was actually the sixth king of Scotland, whose name was James. But as you can see from the chart here, he's a direct descendant of Somerled. He is the 14th generation from Somerled. So if there'd never been a Somerled who met and married Ragnhild Olafsdottir, there never would have been a King James VI of Scotland, who a few years later became King James I of England. In fact, there were a lot of things that happened along the path that indicates just how risky it was to be the kind of king that King James was. One of those things is the gunpowder plot. Here we see a picture of King James with his mother, and she was an interesting character, but we don't have time for all the colorful activities of her life. But his mother got divorced from his father by virtue of getting him killed, and then she married again, and then she miscarried, and then she ends up being captured. William of Orange, who was a defender of the Reformation, he was assassinated, and there was another assassination attempt on Queen Elizabeth. And after Queen Elizabeth died, King James became King of England. But before she died, the Spanish Armada almost ended Protestantism in England. And then after she died and King James was King of England, there was an attempt to kill him, to assassinate him in 1605. Now that's 6 years before the King James Version was authorized. In fact, they've studied using a recreation of what would have been the blow-up of Parliament on the day that King James was supposed to address Parliament. And as it turned out, the guy who was the main planner for this assassination used twice as much gunpowder as what would be needed to blow up the building and kill a lot of legislators as well as the king and members of the king's family who were expected to be in attendance at that time. They discovered the plot at the last minute. That's a whole amazing chapter of providential history. It's worth looking at one of these days. But recognize that Somerled and Ragnhild's 14th generation descendant survived this gunpowder plot in 1605. And 6 years later would sponsor what we call the King James Version. Holland was so happy that he escaped this assassination attempt that they struck an official medallion, and the British established as a holiday of Thanksgiving November the 5th because of the successful defense against this assassination attempt. And they celebrate that to this day as Guy Fawkes Day or Bonfire Day. In the year 2005, there was a reenactment of the gunpowder plot to see what would have happened to the House of Lords and King James and members of his family who would have been in attendance. And what they found was that anything that was within 330 feet radius of where the gunpowder was would have been blown to bits. So that's more than a football field in all directions of where the explosion would have taken place. The point being, we didn't have to have the King James Bible. It could have very easily not have ever happened in the history of the world. How would that have changed world history? Because the King James Bible has been the most published translation of the Bible in the history of the world. In fact, the most published book of any kind in the history of the world. And as a result, many people have had the Bible in their language or have been taught by people who learned the Bible from the English translation. In 2011, when it was the 400th anniversary, there were more than 2 billion printed copies, and then of course that doesn't include online versions like Bible Gateway or what a lot of us use. So, when you think about it, the first ruler of Scotland who legalized the Protestant faith and who promoted it with a Bible in the language of the common people was King James. And yet there never would have been a King James if there had never been a Somerled or his wife Ragnhild. And there wouldn't have been a Somerled if certain individuals would have died at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. There's other things. But anyway, this is just to introduce the concept that God has had to do a lot of work, a lot of details, a lot of timing matters, a lot of getting the right people together at the right time, just for people to have the family trees that they have, so that when they came to earth, they could accomplish the things that God had for them to accomplish. There is an infinite amount of God's glory that is displayed through His providential workings in human history. Okay? In the moments that follow, I'm going to give a couple more examples. Sometimes God's providence is very unusual, and certainly you don't see the blessing right up front. Robert Abernathy was 19 years old, and he was on the side of Scotland against England during the time of Oliver Cromwell's Commonwealth rule. And forgetting the very strange politics that led to one Protestant country fighting another Protestant country, that is what was happening. And in 1652, he was scheduled to be hung for treason because he had sided with the Scots against the English. And they had so many officers that they wanted to execute for treason that they couldn't do them all on the same day, so people had to take turns. And as it turned out, Robert Abernathy was supposed to wait for about a week before it was his turn. I guess they had a rope shortage. Anyway, during that time, someone on the English side said, "Oh, let's not hang him. Let's just send him to America." and make him promise he'll never come back and cause trouble. And so they approached Robert and said, if we were to send you to America as an indentured slave, would you promise on your honor never to come back to the British Isles? And that would spare us the trouble of having to hang you next week. And Robert agreed to that. That makes sense. And so he came to Virginia, and next thing you know, he married a widow named Sarah. And many generations later, you end up with, I don't have a picture, you end up with my mother-in-law, without which you don't get my wife, without which I don't become a father. Here it is, Father's Day, so I appreciate that, and a grandfather. Anyway, the point being, what was trouble in the life of Robert Abernathy resulted in him going across the ocean to meet and marry someone he otherwise never would have met, much less married. And then there were a series of generations after that, eventually resulting in part of my family history. So I encourage you not only to study your own family history, but study the family history of your spouse or of other people who are in-laws to you, as well as people who've had an impact on your life, such as King James, because certainly the King James Bible has had a big impact on my life. I've had occasion to study the family history of others who I'm not closely related to, but whose lives have had an impact on mine, such as Chaplain Bob Webble, who's pictured there on the left. I've published 8 history articles on the amazing family history of his family. They were refugees during and after World War II who eventually made it to America. And he's the one who taught me the basics of the Bible. So I appreciate God's working in their lives and in the lives of their parents, because that ends up having a big impact on how God blesses me. And you can think of people like that in your life, people who've impacted you, that if you were to learn a little bit more about their family history, you would see how much work God had done in the family history that they were born into, which eventually would have an impact on your life. And sometimes that involves travel, a crisis that forces one family to move to another place. We see that in the book of Ruth. Now, it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was a famine in the land. Okay, that was a crisis. No food, that's serious. And a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to sojourn in the country of Moab. That is, he went there thinking this is only going to take a little while. He and his wife and his 2 sons. As it turns out, the 3 men all die there in Moab. They never make it back to Bethlehem. But the 2 sons had married while in Moab, and one of those women was Ruth. And so when Naomi goes back to Bethlehem, she takes Ruth with her, without which Ruth would not marry Boaz. And that's part of the Messianic line. Obviously a very important family line because it directly connects to our Savior in his humanity. So God works through families and multi-generationally. So what can we learn from family history? Just reviewing the 3 points that we started with. Learning family history can help us to better appreciate God for how great he is as our personal creator. And that could be something as simple as remembering that God didn't make me a grackle. But it also includes what I learned about my mother's side of the family, my father's side of the family, and all the work that God did to bring all the right people together at the right times just so that I would eventually become part of that family. Secondly, learning family history of specific people who've had an impact on the world for good, such as King James sponsoring the English Bible and the religious freedom that is needed to really flourish with a Bible in your own language. It can help us to appreciate God's providence and his sovereignty over time and over space, that is, history and geography over many generations. And then thirdly, learning family history of others can help us to appreciate just how valuable those people are to God, that he would do all of that work to make sure that they got here when they did, where they did, as the exact individuals that they are. Well, there's a lot more that we could say, but we're out of time. So we'll just end on the thought that procreation is providential, and happy Father's Day. Let me close in a word prayer. Lord, thank you for all the fathers here today. Thank you for all the work that you've done in many generations of many families, so that each one of us would be who we are, where we are, when we are, as well as receive the blessings from the lives of many other people that we're not closely related to. Thank you for how all of this, in the many details, shows your sovereignty, your providence, your care, just what a great God you are. In Jesus' name, amen.